Hi, welcome back to Everybody Has a Story and YTV. We hope you had a good summer. Much has transpired on the global stage since we left you in May, from Iraq to Syria, Ukraine, Gaza, and elsewhere. Today we're joined to talk about those issues and situations with General Stanley McChrystal, former commander of the International Security Assistance Force and U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and current fellow at the Yale Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. General McChrystal, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So let's start right away with what's probably the biggest security story, which is ISIS. Another beheading video was released and authenticated of journalist Stephen Sotloff following a video of the execution of journalist Jim Foley. President Obama promises retribution and justice for both of these, but there have been some criticisms of his comments around how to deal with ISIS. He says trying to make it a manageable problem, couldn't quite articulate a strategy, which was a criticism both from Democrats and Republicans. Are those criticisms valid?
Well, I think when we think about the region, particularly when we look at the recent beheadings, we need to understand what those are about. They are a symptom, and they are a calculated act on the part of ISIS to make Americans and Westerners emotional and respond emotionally without having done careful thought about what we're going to do. So I think when we think about the problem, and ISIS is a symptom of the problem, we've got a region that is largely in disarray now, and it has been for some time. And so groups like ISIS are able to raise an ideological fervor on the part of, in their case, many Sunnis, young Sunnis who are struggling inside Syria, struggling inside Iraq, and they produce a movement that's violent and it's dangerous. But it's not one we should rush without careful thought to deal with. We do have to deal with ISIS, and it's going to take a long time, and it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be frustrating. But it's not something that warrants a half-cocked response. So I think that all Americans need to do their homework before we take real moves.
Al-Zawahiri just announced that al-Qaeda is starting another offshoot in Southeast Asia. What lessons do we take from dealing with ISIS to try and confront new offshoots, whether it be from Al-Qaeda or other Islamic militant groups in the Middle East or Northern Africa or elsewhere?
I think that Al-Qaeda, of course, is in a little bit of a competitive position with ISIS. Now, ISIS has gotten the headlines and appears to be eclipsing, but they're really very much from the same mold. You're going to always have certain groups of very dedicated, radical thinkers, committed people like the core of Al-Qaeda that began in 1988, or in the case of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. You'll have certain groups that can do this, and you'll always have to deal with that. The problem is when they suddenly find fertile soil in a region or in an area where suddenly they get support from people that otherwise they shouldn't get support from. Most of the Sunni population inside Iraq should not have supported al-Qaeda in Iraq. They did when Abu Musab al-Zarqawi led it. And people in Syria and Iraq should not be supporting al-Baghdadi. But they are, because the situation is what it is. So what we need to understand is the conditions that have created this fertile ground that allows groups like that to suddenly get outsized influence. Those are the things we have to deal with. We can try to go after the core of the groups, and we will, but I think those will come and go. But it's when suddenly they have this traction, they take off like a Silicon Valley startup that suddenly is a multi-billion-dollar company. That shouldn't happen unless the region lacks the kind of stability that it really has to have.
Well, talking about how to respond to these threats, President Obama has been criticized sometimes for not having a doctrine, but other times for having a doctrine that is, what was quoted in newspapers, "Don't do stupid stuff," which is the PG version of that quote. Do presidents actually need a doctrine? Is it a legitimate tool, or is it something that oversimplifies complex situations into a bumper sticker slogan?
Yeah, I think presidents start to be told that they have a doctrine at certain times based upon statements that they make. Sometimes they don't know that they've created. I think the nation needs a set of values and a policy that is clearly understood around the world. Now that doesn't mean that it should be so clearly articulated that it's brittle, that we will do this and we will not do that in every case. There needs to be a certain amount of ambiguity to what the United States will or will not do. But our broad general lines of our policy should not be that way. They should be, people should know what the United States stands for, generally what we will support and what we will oppose, and the prices that we are willing to pay in general. But I think that if we start to criticize every president, and then we say, this doctrine isn't good or isn't right, I think we need to look more broadly at American policy, because I think one of the challenges is I think American government should be this rich debate about many things, but I think there should be less partisanship on foreign policy than there is on the things, what happens in our neighborhood. Because I think to the world, we are never going to appear monolithic, but we should appear united, and I think that's very important.
In your memoir, you talked a bit about the deficit of trust, or the erosion of trust that happened between the White House and military officials and the Department of Defense. What causes that? What's at the root of that? And is there always going to be a deficit of trust between an administration that wants to actively cut defense spending and a Department of Defense and military officials?
I don't know. There's certainly histories. Military spending goes drastically up and down, before and after wars and whatnot. So that's natural. That's a cycle that occurs. I think that the trust that worries me the most is the trust of separation. And we think, you and I personally, Cody, who do we typically not trust? You trust people you don't know. And particularly the more different they are than you. You trust certain people. You go to the local restaurant, you give them money, and you trust that the food that they bring you will be safe because there's a track record to that. And sometimes you even know the people that work there, but you know of them. People that you don't know, strangers, you tend to trust less. And people of a different culture, of different nature, of different language, different religion, we tend to have even less trust because we've got less common experience, so we don't have a foundation for it. What worries me in America is with a fairly professional military and fairly small and not a tremendous amount of engagement with the rest of society, and then with political leadership that also can be very inwardly focused. You remember a campaign runs together, they form a tight team, and it becomes a pretty focused political entity. There's not much interaction between those two worlds until you're suddenly in government together. Then you're asking people who often were educated in different places, had different experience getting there. They're all good people. They all want to do the best for the nation. They're honest people. They're well-intentioned. The problem is when they don't have a foundation of trust, and it takes time to build that. It takes time working together. It gets very difficult. And so you have when the Obama administration came in, they came in with the idea different from some of what the President Bush's administration had. They had to build relationships with the military, but at a very difficult time. Remember, the economy was melting down. They had come in with the avowed desire to finish and get out of Iraq, but to support the war in Afghanistan. And you're trying to deal with three really big issues, and of course a number of others, at a time you're also trying to build those relationships. And so if you think about it, you bring people together to deal with an extraordinary thorny problem, but they've never really dealt before. It's hard to do that, and those stresses and strains make it tough. And so one of the things I worry about with American government, and in any government, is how do we build that foundation of trust upon which you can deal with all the hard issues. They're going to arise. There's just no getting around them. It was interesting. In the time that I outlined in my book, really the decision-making process that really began about the beginning of 2009 and went through that whole year, I really didn't see anybody who was stupid or evil or trying to do the wrong thing on any side. And yet I saw conversations past each other, I saw stresses and strains, some of which were simply exacerbated by the fact that there had not yet been trust built.
Well, let's shift to your personal life since you retired from the military. You recently endorsed a congressional candidate, Seth Moulton, in Massachusetts. There was a good deal of backlash over former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates's memoir, Duty and the Political Commentary It Had. And there's obviously some criticism surrounding military officials wading into political campaigns. What is the proper role of a retired military officer with respect to politics?
Yeah, I think it's careful, and it's probably not the same for everyone. I would remind you that George Washington grew up as a soldier, viewed himself as a soldier, self-identified as a soldier, and then of course he entered politics in a pretty effective way. We've had other military leaders who've gone on to elected office. Some had come from elected office, went to the military, and others went on. So I don't think that's inappropriate. I think participation in the American political landscape is appropriate. I believe military members should vote. I don't believe that while we serve, we should be partisan politically, and we shouldn't certainly be viewed as that. You shouldn't have Republican generals and Democratic generals and whatnot. That's wrong. I do think, however, when they retire, military members of every rank have a responsibility to be participants in our society. I think that you need to do that in a careful way. And I think I've endorsed 2 congressional candidates. They both happen to be Democrats, but it's because I endorsed 2 people that I know. I endorsed 2 veterans. I didn't really even ask them what their positions on issues were. Instead, I endorsed their character, because I believe right now in American government, we need character. And they're going to have to go down into Washington, and they're going to have to make decisions that can't be just a weather vane for what the people in America think at that moment. We're actually electing a representative government so that we get the judgment of committed people. And so that's the kinds of people that I support. And I think that's appropriate to do that. I do think that you have to be careful that if it's viewed that the military starts to become, even the retired military, a unified political force, then I think there's potential danger in that. If it's to improve American schools or to do good things, it's hard to view that kind of participation as not good. But it's maturity that's required, and I think for the most part we do very well at it.
But do you think there's a distinction between, you talked about participating, you mentioned George Washington. Do you think there's a difference between participating, actually going into the fray and running for office, and staying on the outside and endorsing people and using military reputation and clout to back certain candidates?
I'm not sure I see the difference. I think that Dwight David Eisenhower was elected largely because of what he'd done in service, not because of what he did as the president of Columbia University. So I don't think that there's a great difference there. I think that responsible Americans who've contributed to American society have a right and a responsibility to continue to be citizens. And part of citizenship is engagement. And so as long as people do it in a mature fashion, I think it's a very appropriate.
Well, to follow up a question I know you've been asked before, but would you ever consider running for public office?
No, I have no interest in running for public office, but that's a personal decision. That's not because I don't think military should run. In fact, I actually think, I hope that many young veterans that have left the service over the last few years, I hope that they'll enter that. But it's a tough political world now, and I can understand their reticence, and in many ways, I probably represent that, but I hope that they will.
Would you endorse a candidate in the 2016 presidential race, either now or when we get closer to it?
I can't say I would or wouldn't. I have no intention right now of doing that, but I'd have to wait and see. If I thought that the nation would be significantly better served by retired military and other people supporting or endorsing or whatever kind of thing for one candidate over another, I don't think that it would be responsible for any American citizen to simply stand by and do nothing.
Well, we always end our interviews with a speed round, which is just a couple quick questions. So the first one, favorite military film?
Probably Gettysburg.
Best part about teaching at Yale?
The young people. They are absolutely 100 times more open-minded than I expected.
Book you would assign every Yale student, not just your class?
A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain.
General McChrystal, thanks so much for joining us.
Cody, thank you. I appreciate it.